US-Canada trade relations continue to heat up and Canadians are going broke. It's looking like the only way that Western Canada is going to be able to survive this is by becoming the 51st state. We are seeing investor capital flee Canada at an alarming rate and head straight down to the US. But don't worry, the liberal economists are there to write their scary articles on how if Alberta leaves, they're going to go broke. We will get into that, and that's all going on as we are seeing internal sabotage on major nation-building projects that is continuing to hurt Canada. But America, you're not innocent in that either. We got some projects to go over. And while all of these tensions are happening, we had a Canadian arrested by the U.S. Coast Guard for allegedly doing nothing. But he is French, so can he be trusted? We'll talk about all that today. It's getting insane, so let's get into it.
Well, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, or CFIB, is raising a red flag that our economy could be in for a rough ride. Its quarterly forecast saying that the forecast for the second quarter is dropping to 0.8%, dropping by that in the second quarter, and could fall a further 0.8% in the third quarter. If that happens, we will be in a recession. The report notes most businesses expect long-term supply disruptions thanks to, you guessed it, Donald Trump's trade war against Canada, 6 months and counting.
So it is funny that once again, America is going to get blamed for Canada's underperformance. And yes, it would, I say it in all the videos, Trump's tariffs are a factor, but not the factor for the recessionary problems. We all know Canada had a major immigration problem. They had government spending problem. All of the issues they had were way bigger than just Trump coming in with his tariffs. They didn't help, but it's bigger than that.
As well as delays at the American border. There are about 400,000 vacant jobs in the private sector. And here's another bad
That's another one. Oh, we got a labor shortage. Sure, nobody can get a job.
sign. Private investment nosediving, or expected to anyway, down 13% in Q2 and predicted to drop again by about 7% in the third quarter. Let's bring in...
And that's the number that is very important from that story. I mean, there's lots of information, of course, classic. Canadians can only blame Americans for their problems. That's the way that it seems to go. But we have the numbers to back it up. Foreign investors lower exposure to Canada selling GOC paper. Foreign investors also reducing their exposure, suggesting growing skepticism about Canada's short-term prospects. Foreign investors sold off $2.8 billion in Canadian securities in May, also marking a fourth consecutive month of divestment. Even the TSX, which outperformed by raising 5.4% in May, saw foreign investors sell off $11.4 billion in stocks. Foreign investors are also shifting expectations of Canadian debt performance. Money market divestment hits $4.5 billion in May, primarily the Government of Canada paper, treasury bills with maturities under 1 year. And that's with on top of Canadians themselves don't even believe in Canada anymore and are buying more American stocks and selling domestic. So if Canadians at the domestic level are going, well, you know what, I'd rather buy American, maybe there's a problem in Canada if they're not willing to invest in themselves. Since Canadians are putting their elbows down when it comes to exposure to American stocks. Canadian investors increased their net position in foreign securities by $13.4 billion in May, up 227% from April. They pumped $14.2 billion into the U.S. stocks, the biggest inflow since February. Yes, Canadians are losing faith in Canada as an institution. And that's why it's looking like Alberta, Western Canada separation is going to be better and better. But don't worry, we've got Trevor Tombe, who is a famous liberal economist. And this is why it's important as well to go over articles like this when we're talking about what would happen if Western Canada were to leave, potentially become the 51st state. Because this is a guy who the mainstream news uses as the voice of, like, we brought in our resident economist, Trevor Tombe, and he gets featured on all of these channels. And you can see his liberal bias comes through, and he has a controlled narrative when he puts this out. Identity, culture, and historical grievances drive many independence movements around the world. Quebec's sovereignty movement, for instance, centers on language, cultural differences with the rest of Canada. And that's important. We'll get into that later. But Alberta's separatist impulse is different. It's almost entirely about money. See, right away, that's not true. Alberta also has their own culture that they would like to protect. And guess what? Alberta has way more in common with Montana and the US than it does with Quebec. And Quebec is basically a drain on Alberta, hates Alberta. Montana's like, hey, we're your friendly neighbor. We'd love to have you on board. And Quebec's like, we hate you. And then he says, when the argument for separation leans so heavily on economics, as it does often in Alberta, it's worth examining the claims more closely. And I do think that it's just easier for them to lead with economics, because if they go with like, yeah, we'd like way less immigration and we want to protect Alberta's sovereignty because of that, then people will call them all the names and bring out all of the nonsense arguments, which undermines the movement. And he calls it a fiscal fantasy. He's like, let's start with taxes. Scrapping income and sales taxes would cut nearly $80 billion from government revenues. That's the combined current federal and provincial take from these sources. The amount represents over half of what the Prosperity Project assumes the new country would collect in new total revenue. And I brought up some of their statement here because, yeah, they talk about, the revenues and eliminating the GST. The GST is a federal tax, so that goes specifically just to the federal government to be set on fire for asylum claims. One thing that I think would make more sense, especially with Alberta looking for either sovereignty or becoming the 51st state, joining the US, and we can clearly see, and any of the Americans watching, there was a concerted effort by the premier, aka the governor of Alberta, who was flying down constantly to try and meet with Trump and his team to be like, how do we get deals going? And one of the things that they want to do when it comes to the currency is they said they want to use a temporary use of the US dollar during transition, have swap lines with US banks for liquidity and resilience. I don't think it would make sense to make a new Alberta dollar. It would just make way more sense to change to USD if you're going to fight for sovereignty and some way more economic connection with the US, which we're clearly going to see. Just deal in USD, because you're going to be a resource and commodity economy anyways, which is all traded in USD as it stands. But one of the other things that I found was really funny, and again, just kind of showing from a liberal bias standpoint, he tries to bring up the gap with defense spending. So he says, oh, defense spending reveals another fantasy. Okay. While the report estimates Alberta national defense would cost a modest $3 to $5 billion, meeting NATO's 2% GDP target would require $10 billion initially, rising to $25 billion under the alliance's new 5% target. Well, I haven't noticed you calling out Canada for never hitting the 2%, Canada not hitting the 5%, but the new sovereign nation of Alberta, whether they become their own country, I don't think that automatically means they would be part of NATO. So would they even be required to pay into that? And the other option is, if they were to join the US as a state or some sort of territory, whatever the connection is between the US and Western Canada, I don't think they'd have to worry about much of the defense spending as well. If this guy was not disingenuous with his arguments, he would know most of the countries who file expenses under their NATO defense spending all use random domestic infrastructure projects. They all use border security. They use all sorts of things. They say it's for defense, which Alberta could do just the same thing. But of course, he uses, oh, here's worst case scenario for what your defense spending is going to be, what you're going to be required to do. And then he even uses worst case scenario on, oh, we think the economic reality is if that happens, people are going to leave Alberta, and then we think 8% of the population, about 400,000 people, will leave seeking opportunities elsewhere. Based on what? Based on Alberta now doing better? Because he's saying, well, they're going to leave. Well, if Alberta's doing better and now it's connected to America, or it's its own sovereign nation, or whatever it is, so now people are going to want to leave. As of right now, everybody's flooding to Alberta because of what Alberta offers. It's one of the few growing provinces in all of Canada. But if they become sovereign and start to offer more opportunity, get more major projects, all of these things, they're going to leave. The rest of Canada would also suffer if Alberta left, but far less. Oh yeah, you think Quebec, who gets tens of billions of dollars in equalization payments per year, is going to suffer less if Alberta leaves? Tens of billions of dollars? Okay, sure. And it's just funny, but the fiscal and economic claims at the heart of such proposals are simply false. Well, you're going by your scenario that you've run. They're going by their scenario that they've run. And a separate Alberta would be a poorer Alberta. You're using projections. They're using projections. So yes, you can say your opinion is this. And it's funny, when he uses his projections, and again, all of the liberal economists seem to miss out on these very basic things like taxes and basic expenditures on the average Canadian family from 1961 to 2024. Well, the top line there, which is absolutely skyrocketing, is what Canadians are paying in taxes on average. Do Canadians out there feel like the amount of taxes increasing has been a net benefit to Canadian lifestyle? Because cost of living's sure not getting better. And it's funny because what's one of the main things people complain about right now? Shelter. What's one of the other things? Food. Not so much clothing, so I'm not going to talk about that. But look how much higher the taxes expenses than shelter when we have a living crisis in Canada, but there's taxes. Hey, Trevor Tombe, why don't you address that? Why don't you address Canadians getting taxed to absolute death and how Alberta would be able to keep more of that money? Because the ironic thing is Alberta pays money to Ottawa to process the taxes and all of these other things when they could be creating their own public sector jobs, which Ottawa loves to create, inside of Alberta, keeping the money inside the province, or again, joining the US and becoming the 51st state. And then you see comments like this and you realize how possible it is to deal with some of these problems when it comes to becoming either, again, 51st state or sovereign.
For the RCMP expected this year is $4.8 billion. It's divided by every Canadian taxpayer, which comes out to about $121 for this year per person. The expenses for the OPP in 2019 was $2.8 billion, and for the population of Ontario in 2019, it amounted to $195 per person, and that was only in Ontario. Paid 62% more than the RCMP. And we have a manpower issue as well with just getting recruits. Like that one person said with the RCMP, they have a manpower issue. I don't know how we're going to resolve that, and as well as just buying new facilities, as well as support staff.
Got it.
Just
Got
everything.
So let's look at the finances, right? Yep. It's a great question. Fair point. Anybody?
I'm not, well, first of all, Alberta owns all of the assets associated with the RCMP. So if there was a replacement, we would get all of those assets. Secondly, Grande Prairie just went through this exercise. And what they discovered is that they could either save $8 million by having their own municipal police force, or they could double their force. And so that's what they've chosen to do. So instead of having 55 officers, they're going to have 110 officers for the same budget. And when they did a call for resumes, they had 200 people who applied.
So it's so funny, again, because every single thing that they go, oh, well, how are you going to deal with this? Danielle Smith and the Albertans are like, oh, well, we could do X, Y, Z. And they're like, ah. Meanwhile, we've got Danielle Smith out here trying to get major pipelines going, which are being sabotaged internally. Let's get into her statements here. Did you like the video yet? We're trying to get these videos in front of more people, trying to grow the channel. If you like what we talk about here, feel free to subscribe. Love to have you on board. Let's get back to it.
Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith says she is still hoping to resurrect the Northern Gateway Pipeline project in BC. Plans for the pipeline from Bruderheim to Kitimat, BC were rejected by then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Smith says she and BC Premier David Eby have a lot in common when it comes to energy projects, and says there's potential to take a new look at the plans.
May not be the same route. It certainly needs to have a lot more consultation.
Maybe the route is going through the U.S., which I want to touch on that shortly, Americans.
The first time that it went through, it had 35 Indigenous partners who were equity owners in that, and that has to be the starting point for any new project. There has to be meaningful engagement and meaningful economic involvement of nations.
BC's
Does there have to be, Danielle?
Premier says he agrees with Smith that there is a lot to do as far as work on a project that would create economic opportunities for both provinces, though he says the pipeline would need private sector support before BC's government would turn its attention to it.
And that's why I do think it would make so much more economic sense to try and get a pipeline going with the U.S. before it would trying to get things working in Canada domestically. And that's the embarrassing thing. But when you look at some of these price targets for how much they could be generating in income, like this project she's talking about right now is not small numbers. It's $300 billion in economic activity over its lifetime for one pipeline. Americans, surely you got to be interested in getting that pipeline there. What keeps happening is Canada premiers, aka our governors, keep walking away from pipeline deals. So Kinu walks away from pipeline deal. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, yes, he is Indigenous, chose not to sign an interprovincial trade agreement unveiled on Tuesday in Alberta. Saskatchewan and Ontario citing the need for Indigenous consensus before moving forward with major infrastructure projects. So somehow we've devolved to a point where less than 5% of the population gets to make the decision for 100% of the population, because every project is being held up by allegedly, I'm going to say, these indigenous groups, even though the Northern Gateway Pipeline did have almost full indigenous approval and Justin Trudeau shut it down. The Memorandum of Understanding signed during the Council of the Federation meeting in Huntsville, Ontario, commits these three provinces to collaborate. The goal is to expand market access for Canadian oil, gas, and critical minerals while reducing reliance on foreign trade partners. Canoe's absence from the agreement raises questions, especially given Manitoba's geographic location as a natural link in any east-west corridor. However, in a public statement, the Premier said Manitoba's decision to not participate was intentional. And we all know it was intentional, and we all know how to get our boy Wab on board and all of the Indigenous nations free F-150s. I'm ready to sweeten the deal, guys. 2025 Lariat, 82,000 MSRP. Guys, we are talking wrapped heated steering wheel, center console, heated and ventilated trim seating services. Come on, chrome surround. This is basically a larger Cadillac, and that's what we have potential. If you guys just get on board the Indigenous communities, I will talk to them for you. And this is why I wanted to bring the Americans in on this too, because it would be amazing for Alberta to start to get some actual commitment to some pipelines in the US as well. But we tried that, and the Keystone pipeline officially canceled after Biden revokes key permit. Obviously, it would be awesome to think, oh, if Western Canada is going to join the US, there'd be all these economic growth, all of these this potential. But you know, Biden just as quickly as Trudeau shut down these pipelines based on just green politics. So there would need to be some level of guarantee, like, okay, this project has 100% guarantee to be completed, regardless of if it takes 4 years, 5 years, if there's a Democratic president in the future, because it is a big risk for Alberta to want to leave, make these other commitments, and then have pipelines shut down just the same. Obviously, I don't think Trump's going to be shutting down the pipelines, but with how long these projects could take, who knows if he would still be president by then. But at the end of the day, we need these tensions to calm down, because Quebec man is warning Canadian boaters after he was detained by the U.S. Coast Guard and put in a jail cell. A Quebec man says he's outraged after the U.S. Coast Guard accused him of fishing in American waters. Then they arrested him before putting him in jail for nearly 2 hours. Edouard Lelamond, first of all, he should have just been named Edward Lamond, and then people wouldn't have been mad at you. He said he nearly drowned during the ordeal last Sunday afternoon after the Coast Guard's boat pushed his boat, causing it to capsize. Lelamond said he borrowed his friend's boat and he was fishing near Venise-en-Quebec, which is roughly 15 kilometers, or what is that, like 9 miles north of the U.S. border at the northern tip of Lake Champlain. Jeez, guys, these French. He says he's been fishing for decades and is adamant he was in Canadian waters when the Coast Guard showed up and told him to turn off his engine, to which he complied. The 3 officers told him he was in U.S. territory. I said, no, I'm very sorry, I'm in Canada. And I said, I'm polite enough to talk to you guys, but you cannot arrest me. You can't come across the border to pick me up, but they did, he recalled. Lelamond said he started his engine and said he wanted to talk with the officers by the shore, but the Coast Guard followed and tried to push him into the U.S., which then caused him to go overboard. They're tying my boat to their boat. They're not even taking care of me. The 3rd time I went down, coming out of the water with my mouth spitting out, I said, throw me a buoy, he said. And once on their vessel, he was aggressively put in handcuffs. I never saw someone so angry. This is so funny. He was then handed over to the U.S. Customs Border Protection officer, who fingerprinted him, put him in jail cell, and his clothes soaking wet, and gave him a dirty blanket. I said, are you arresting me? No, sir, you are detained. I said, detained for what? I said, you arrest me. I don't do nothing to you guys. I didn't even hit you guys. First of all, why would you say that? I didn't even hit you guys. Were they accusing you of hitting them? The U.S. Coast Guard said in a statement to CTV News that Lelamond was in U.S. Customs waters when they approached him on July 20th at about 5:30 p.m. While the Coast Guard's 29-foot response boat, small, I don't know what that means, was alongside the vessel, the operator put the vessel in motion and ignored commands to maintain course. The vessel then made an abrupt starboard turn, struck the port bow of the Coast Guard's small boat. Okay, so that's boat small, it's an error. Small boat at coordinates blah, 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 approximately 65 yards south of the U.S.-Canadian border. I will say that is extremely narrow margin of error at 65 yards south of the border. The collision caused the vessel to capsize, putting the operator in the water. The statement reads, that story there sounds like a bit of he said, she said. I will say 65 yards is an extremely small amount that they could have. Why did they need to board him if he was that close? They should have been like, hey man, you're a little too close. Like, that's very small. That being said, if he did try to run away, which is very possible because people love to change their stories after the fact, I don't know what happened here. It sounds like he's fine. He's home. He didn't get in any real trouble. The Canadian news loves to share these scary border stories, trying to scare Canadians of those scary Americans, especially when we see most of Canada's problems are happening domestically, and a lot of them could be fixed by joining the US or getting some sort of Western sovereignty. But if you made it this far in the video, you absolutely rock. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We're trying to get these videos out in front of more people, help grow the channel. If you want to contribute to the channel, the link is down below as well. You can do it through YouTube. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.